Matthew chapter 19 is where we are. We have been in a variety of different sections of these four inspired accounts. In Matthew chapter 19, Matthew gives us the indication that Jesus is heading back towards Judea. Matthew 19 and verse 1. When Jesus had finished these sayings, he went away from Galilee in the north and entered the region of Judea beyond the Jordan. Our red dot is Jerusalem, where he is ultimately heading. This is the large region of Judea, and at the moment in Matthew 19, he is on the east side of the Jordan River. We're told in verse 2 that large crowds followed him, and he healed them there. Something that he has been doing, obviously, for a couple of years now. Verse 3 of Matthew chapter 19 tells us that Pharisees came up to him and tested him. It's important for Matthew to get across to us the motive behind their question. They don't just want to know what Jesus has to say on this given topic, but they're testing him. And this is not the first time. It's not the last. They're trying to get him in whatever trouble, in whatever area of disrepute that they can possibly get him. And so they raise these different difficult issues, and this is just the latest of them. They tested him by asking, is it lawful to divorce one's wife for any cause? Now, we want to pause there for just a moment. And you keep your marker there in Matthew 19 and turn back with me in your Bibles to Deuteronomy chapter 24. This is one of the formative passages, if not the formative passage that these people would have had in mind from the law of Moses when it came to this issue. Remember who they were in the context of Deuteronomy 24. For hundreds of years they have been, the descendants of Abraham, have been slaves. They've been led out by Moses, but Moses is not a king. He's not a judge per se or a governor. He's just the instrument that God used to deliver these people. And here they are. They've been conditioned for hundreds of years by slavery under the thumb of Pharaoh. And now they're let out and they don't have any law. They don't have any earthly king. There is very little guidance. And so God uses Moses to bring them down to Sinai and begins to deliver a little over 600 laws between Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And this is one of them, okay, that God delivers to these people who are just beginning to learn to work together. Deuteronomy chapter 24 and verse 1. When a man takes a wife and marries her, if then she finds no favor in his eyes because he has found some indecency or uncleanness, some of our translations read, he finds some indecency in her, and he writes her a certificate of divorce and puts it in her hand and sends her out of his house, and she departs out of his house, and if she goes and becomes another man's wife, and the latter man hates her and writes her a certificate of divorce and puts it in her hand and sends her out of his house, or if the latter man dies who took her to be his wife, then this is the guideline, this is the law. Her former husband who sent her away may not take her again to be his wife after she has been defiled, for that is an abomination before the Lord, and you shall not bring sin upon the land that the Lord your God is giving you for an inheritance. Okay, we'll talk a little bit more about that in just a moment. You might flip your marker back there to Deuteronomy 24 and go back with me to Matthew 19, our primary text. This is the kind of passage the Pharisees would have in mind in Matthew 19 as they come to Jesus and they ask, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any cause? And in their minds, when these kinds of questions are posed to try and test Jesus, a lot of times they're trying to catch him on one of two or three or four horns of dilemma. And in this case, it was well known in first century Judea. You had two basic schools of thought. There were two men who had lived very recently or were even still alive, depending on our frame of reference. Two great rabbis of the Jews, who had basically come out and formed two schools of thought that nearly all of the Pharisees or the Sadducees, the people of Israel, would buy into. One or the other, two major schools of thought. One of those was perpetuated by a rabbi named Shammai. You see where he lived, 50 years BC, 30 years AD. Very well may still have been alive at this moment. Very close to the end of his life. He defined, and those who bought into this school of thought, defined that indecency or that uncleanness in Deuteronomy 24 as unchastity. Sexual unfaithfulness. That God, when He was talking about in Deuteronomy 24, that uncleanness, that's what He had in mind. And He wrote, if a woman were as mischievous as the wife of Ahab, her husband should not divorce her except it be on the ground of adultery. One major school of thought that the Pharisees were familiar with, that Jesus would have been familiar with. The other came from a man who lived a long time, historically, about 120 years, we are told. School of Hillel, another rabbi, who said, no. In Deuteronomy 24, that indecency or that uncleanness is much more broad and all-encompassing. It applies in the widest of senses. And he declared it was sufficient ground for divorce if a woman even spoiled her husband's dinner. That would be indecency. That would be this uncleanness. And everything from that all the way to unchastity. And so here are the Pharisees, and they've tracked down Jesus on the eastern side of the Jordan River, and they ask him this question to test him. Because either way he goes, they think they've got him, right? Is it lawful to divorce one's wife for any reason? If you answer yes, you're going to alienate yourself from the school of Shammai. If you answer no, it upsets the school of Hillel. And who else does it probably upset? It upsets God above all. Upsets God. Think back historically here. There was somebody who reigned in this area.
Moses.
And not Moses. What'd you say?
David?
Not David. Someone contemporary with Jesus. Good answers so far. Herod. Just 5 chapters before this in Matthew 14. We won't take the time to go back and read it. Herod Antipas is the big honcho in this area, right? And John the Baptist had come along and said, it is not lawful for you to have this woman that you have taken as your wife. She was your brother's wife, and now you have her, and that is unlawful. And what had Herod done to John the Baptist?
Had his head taken off.
He'd had him thrown in prison, and eventually had him, or allowed him to be beheaded. Right? Now that's just 5 chapters later. Probably a matter of months since then. Do the Pharisees know that story? Sure, they know that story. And here is Jesus, a perpetual thorn in their side, and they've tested him a variety of different ways. Do you think they know how he's going to answer that? If he's going to come down in one of those schools of thought, which one is he going to come down in? You think as they're turning it around in their head. I have a feeling they thought he'd come down in the first one. Right? They knew enough about Jesus, odds are, that they had a pretty good idea he wouldn't fall in that more liberal of schools. And so, if we can pose this question, and if we can get him to answer no, maybe we can get Herod to do our dirty work for us, because we know what he did to John the Baptist. And we know that Jesus has said good things about John the Baptist. And if we can get him to condemn Herod's message, just like he condemned, or John the Baptist did, maybe we can get him out of the way altogether. Pretty good plan as far as human reasoning is concerned, right? And so we approach him on the other side of the Jordan River, and if he gives us the answer we want, you better believe we're going to run all the way to Herod and tell him, do you have any idea what that Jesus of Nazareth said? Just like they're going to run to Pilate eventually. Okay? That's our setting. Which one is Jesus, which school of thought in Matthew 19 is Jesus going to come down on? And as he does repeatedly in these kinds of scenarios, Jesus doesn't come down where they expect. And he confounds them with his answer. He answered, have you not read that he who created them from the beginning made them male and female, and said, therefore a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. What therefore God has joined together, let not man separate. Do you think they saw that coming? Probably not. Now, what is the genius behind how Jesus reasons? Why not just tell them which one of these schools of thought he most naturally bought into? Casey?
He throws his lot in with God.
Okay.
They have to disagree with God.
Yeah, exactly. Like Gordon had brought up before, ultimately this is an issue over which God had intentions, okay? And so you cast your lot with God, and if there's disagreement with that, the problem is a problem I have with God, okay? So he makes it much bigger than just two rival rabbis and inserts God into the discussion. David, go ahead.
That is that man complicates everything.
Yeah.
Just all the time.
Yeah. Jesus goes past thousands of years of argument, thousands of years of debate, and takes us all the way back to the beginning. And any time in the Bible, there's this difficult, messy issue that's talked about, and one of the inspired writers or the Son of God takes us all the way back to the beginning. It's almost always pretty simple, pretty straightforward, and has amazing ability to cut through all of the debate and all of the confusion and all of these different human injections. Let's go back to what the Creator said in the very beginning. He created them male and female. Jesus doesn't just begin at the point of crisis. He doesn't just begin by talking about divorce. No, he goes all the way back to the divine institution of marriage. Let's talk about what God did. And let's talk about what God said. He, from the beginning, made them male and female. He said, a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife. The two shall become one flesh. They're no longer two, but one flesh. He joins them together. And if this is something that God is doing, man shouldn't separate it. Now, in their anxiousness, of course, to still try and pin him down somehow or test him and cast some sort of a negative light, well, we're going to bring up Deuteronomy 24 and verse 1 in a sense again, right? Completely disregarding, really, Jesus' train of thought and the reason that he goes beyond Moses and beyond culture and beyond history all the way back to the beginning. In verse 7, why then did Moses command one to give a certificate of divorce and to send her away? You think about what we read in Deuteronomy chapter 24. Obviously, these are the words of God. What is God trying to regulate there in Deuteronomy 24 as we read that? We read the first 4 verses. Got a lawless people that are led out into the middle of nowhere, and all of these laws that are built kind of as a hedge to guard personal conduct and national allegiance and practices of worship. And this is one of the things that's tossed out there. That if a man and a woman, if there is some sort of uncleanness or indecency in her, and he sends her away, and then she's joined to another man, and she's sent away again, she is not allowed to come back to that first man. Alan, go ahead.
Is there anything involved in this in Deuteronomy where the first husband owns the husband for life?
Owns the wife for life?
In other words, she married whatever dowry she gets. Does that belong? Because they came from the Egypt and they were in slavery.
Right. You know, I don't think God viewed her as personal property of that first man, even though that was a common conception, obviously, in the cultural ancient world. We don't really run across that kind of indication in either the Old or the New Testaments. Gordon, go ahead.
Had they not done this, did this because of the hardness of the heart, we have to keep that in mind.
Right.
Where would that leave the woman?
Yeah.
She wouldn't be free to she would just be...
She would basically, in a sense, be property, like Alan is getting at, right? I think a lot of what we're reading in Deuteronomy 24, the first 4 verses, have to do with the rights of that woman, right? Where God is regulating, where it would be very easy for these hard-hearted men to treat their wives just as nothing but property. And I send her away, and well, she's with somebody else for a while, but maybe I'd like to bring her back, and then I'll have her for a while, and then I'll send her away again, and then maybe if I want her to come back eventually, I'll bring her back again. And God is definitely building a hedge around that idea. Alan, go ahead.
Why is it always the woman's fault? Why ain't the man at fault?
Yeah, good question. A lot of times in these kinds of hypothetical discussions, it is the man and the woman who is sent away. We're going to notice here in the Gospel of Matthew how it certainly appears as if it can go either way. I think that becomes clear the more we acquaint ourselves with what Jesus says across the Gospels. Their question, completely disregarding what Jesus has gone back and referenced in Genesis 1:27, Genesis chapter 2, their question is, well, why did Moses command one to give a certificate of divorce and to send her away? Was Moses commanding them to do that?
No, he's printed it.
Yeah. And Jesus again tweaks their understanding. Because of your hardness of heart, Moses allowed you to divorce your wives, but from the beginning it was not so. Now let me ask you a question. If Jesus is just one of a long line of great teachers in the history of these people, what is this? I mean, this is just what the latest teacher says. Right? Moses said this, Jesus says this, but, maybe I prefer what Moses said. He was a great teacher, and Jesus is able to do some amazing things, but Moses could too. Moses was, we read that he was able to do miracles, and we see with our own eyes that Jesus is able to do some things, but I prefer what Moses says. If Jesus is just on the level of Moses and Abraham and Elijah and Jeremiah and all of these other great spokesmen, well, maybe you take it, maybe you don't. But if Jesus is the I am that he has claimed to be, if before Abraham was, he is, if he is God's Son, and he's taking us back to the beginning, now what is this? This supersedes what Moses allowed because of the hardness of hearts, doesn't it? Dave, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say, Jesus calls out a major difference. And, their view was Moses commanded. He changed. He said, no, Moses, it was permitted.
Yeah.
And so, and then he takes it back to what, God says about it.
Right.
And so, he's calling out a major difference in terms of the level of authority and who says and who's right.
Right. He clarifies for them what Moses had intended. And then in verse 9 he says, and I say to you. We're dealing with an authoritative statement of the Son of God. We are dealing with a statement of authority coming from Emmanuel, God with us. And during this formative period, because of the hardness of your hearts, Moses allowed this. And I want to clarify that. But I say to you, and that ought to certainly grab our attention. Whoever divorces his wife except for sexual immorality and marries another commits adultery. This is not the first time that he had spoken out about that. Back in Matthew chapter 5 in his great Sermon on the Mount, in talking about hardness of heart and outward actions, he had said, it was also said, whoever divorces his wife, let him give her a certificate of divorce. But I say to you, in Matthew 5:32, that everyone who divorces his wife, except on the ground of sexual immorality, makes her commit adultery. And whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. This is what Moses had said, and I'm going to clarify that, but we take what Jesus said in Matthew 5 and in Matthew 19, we go to what he taught in Mark chapter 10, a parallel account, and we begin to put all of this together and we get a clear picture of what God had intended, rooted all the way in creation. The man who divorces his wife for any reason other than sexual immorality and marries another commits adultery. That's straight out of Matthew 19:9. The man who divorces his wife for the reason of sexual immorality, or to Alan's question, I don't think there's anything biblically that would lead us to believe this is flip-flopped, right? Especially throughout the rest of the New Testament, as men and women are described as joint heirs of life, and we have different ways that we serve, but that we are all children of God. I think this goes either way, right? Describing. Dave, you had your hand raised.
I was just going to comment, Jason, that if this applied, kind of one-way direction, a man's point of view, then it would make God a respecter of persons.
Yeah.
And so we know clearly that this is regarding a man or a woman, a husband or a wife.
I think that's a good point. Finally, the man who marries a divorcee, we went back and we read Matthew 5. It is re-echoed in Mark chapter 10. The man who marries a woman whose divorce was not due to her previous husband's adultery commits adultery. We can go back and begin to draw a couple of more logical conclusions. A marriage can exist on two different levels, right? One that is lawful and one that is legal. In verse 3, Jesus is asked whether divorce for any cause is lawful. And what is his answer? His answer is no in Matthew 19. There's only one ground for a lawful divorce: sexual immorality. How is it then that a man can divorce his wife who has not committed sexual immorality? Well, he can do so legally. Herod Antipas declared it legal, right, as the reigning authority in that region. But that didn't make it lawful as far as God was concerned. Civil courts today will grant a divorce even when there is no lawful reason for it. A couple can be unlawfully but legally divorced. A couple can be divorced in the eyes of men, but not in God's. That's why John speaks up in Matthew chapter 14 and says, "It is not lawful for you to have her." It's why a person who is unlawfully divorced commits adultery when they remarry. Because in God's eyes, They are still bound, to borrow the phrase that Paul uses in 1 Corinthians chapter 7. As far as God is concerned, those two have not been separated, right? And God joined them together. And only God can separate them. They are still bound together, bound to the first spouse, even though a human court has approved their divorce. Now, this obviously frequently raises all sorts of questions. If I can answer a question quickly, I'll do that. If it's a question that is covered in that mega series that we have back there on this elaborate issue, I might refer you to that, because we don't want to chase this rabbit hole too far when we've got resources in the back. Alan, did you have your hand raised? Go ahead.
Let's go to taxes. Why should we support a country that legally does this?
That's one I'm going to say maybe we'll talk about later, because we've got a little bit of Matthew chapter 19 still to cover. Maybe we can touch on that briefly when Jesus talks about rendering unto Caesar what is Caesar's. That's a good question, and my 15-second answer is we don't live under a theocracy, right? And God doesn't call us to live under a theocracy. That does not exist. He calls us to live as the salt of the earth and the light of the world within the kingdoms that we are a part of. And if Jesus would tell His disciples to render unto Caesar's what is Caesar's, I think He would tell us to do the same thing. That's my quick answer. Go ahead.
My addition to your quick answer
Yes.
is that those are two separate issues.
Yeah.
I mean, paying taxes, even during this time, they were required to pay taxes to Rome.
Yeah.
I mean, you think about all the idolatry and everything else that was going on. Jesus required them to pay taxes.
Yeah.
This is about how this is God's law.
Right. This goes beyond
man's law.
Right.
This is a separate issue.
Goes beyond the boundaries of human nations. It goes beyond human culture. It goes beyond history, all the way back
to the very beginning. I think that's a good way of summarizing.
Okay. Matthew chapter 19. Like I said, if this is an issue that you would like to delve more into, I think we have a total of 8 sermons back there that really look at this from all different kinds of perspectives. And so if you would like that, please let me know and we'll make sure you get a copy of that. In verse 13 of Matthew chapter 19, the children were brought to Him that He might lay His hands on them and pray. The disciples rebuked the people, but Jesus said, "Let the little children come to me and do not hinder them. For to such belongs the kingdom of heaven." And He laid His hands on them and went away. A great honor that rabbis of the day would do, of course, to lay their hands on a little child and maybe pronounce some sort of a blessing. We talked a little bit about this the first Sunday morning in October in our sermon, talking about the innocence of little children and the moldability of little children and the humility of little children. Jesus does not say the kingdom of heaven is made up of little children. He said of such, right? Those who understand and become like little children. There are ways, obviously, that God tells us, grow up. Don't be children in your thinking. And then in some other ways, He says, you need to be like little children. Okay? In this way, eager and willing to be molded by God and remaining humble. And if God says it, even though it's completely foreign and opposed to what I've always said, I'm going to follow in simple, childlike, trusting faith. And in the last section of Matthew 19, we've got an example of what Jesus is looking for in a young man who does not model what we just read. Behold, a man came up to Him, saying, "Teacher, what good deed must I do to have eternal life?" And He said to him, "Why do you ask me about what is good? There is only one who is good." Now, if Jesus is a liar, if He is some sort of a lunatic, then He's not worthy of being described as good, right? But if He is God, then whatever answer He's going to give is authoritative, right? The question is, what good deed must I do to have eternal life? Jesus answers, if you would enter life, keep the commandments. And the question is, which ones? And so Jesus recites the 6th and the 7th and the 8th and the 9th and the 5th. And then he summarizes it with, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. The young man said to him, all these I have kept. What do I still lack? Jesus said to him, if you would be perfect, go. Sell what you possess and give to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven, and come, follow me. When the young man heard this, he went away sorrowfully, for he had great possessions. Very quickly, why did Jesus not say this to everybody? Why did this man? Jesus quotes the 6th and the 7th and the 8th and the 9th and the 5th commandment. And he goes back in that passage, I think it's Leviticus chapter 19, and he says, you love your neighbor as yourself. Why didn't he tell this to everybody? Casey?
That's what he was missing. He had other things, but that's what he treasured.
In another context, when Jesus is asked, what is the greatest law? What's he going to say? Love God with everything. And isn't that what is in some ways missing with this man? Jesus puts a practical template on it. He knows, right? As he looks at people, he knows what is in their heart. He knows the obstacles. And so here is a man who treasures stuff. He's doing some good religious things, but he treasures stuff as ultimate. And so Jesus makes him look in the mirror. And at least on this occasion, he goes away sorrowfully, for he has great possessions. And it is here, of course, that Jesus says it is only with great difficulty that a rich person will enter the kingdom of heaven. Easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich person to enter the kingdom of heaven. I would suggest to you, like I did 2 weeks ago, we ought to pay attention to that. Because as far as we are concerned versus this man, we are very rich. Very rich indeed. Some sobering things. I appreciate you being here. Lord willing, we will press on in week number 40, I believe it is, next Sunday morning. Thank you.